Chapter 12. In the Mist. At last the storm gradually died down. The clamor on the mountain ceased, and it was time to resume the journey. However, the weather had broken completely, and though the storm itself was over, thick mist and cloud remained, shrouding everything on the heights. When they started, the mist was so thick that they could see only the trees on either side of the narrow path, and even they looked ghostly and unreal. The rest of the forest was simply swallowed up and entirely lost to sight, veiled in a cold and clammy white curtain. The ground was dreadfully muddy and slippery, and although the path did not climb nearly so steeply as before, after some hours, Much Afraid found to her amazement that she was missing the rolling thunder of the storm, and even the sickening crash of the trees as the lightning splintered them. She began to realize that, cowardly though she was, there was something in her which responded with a surge of excitement to the tests and difficulties of the way better than to easier and duller circumstances. It was true that fear sent a dreadful shuddering thrill through her, but nevertheless it was a thrill, and she found herself realizing with astonishment that even the dizzy precipice had been more to her liking than this dreary plodding on and on through the bewildering midst. In some way, the dangers of the storm had stimulated her. Now there was nothing but tameness, just a trudge forward, day after day, able to see nothing except for white, clinging mist which hung about the mountains without a gleam of sunshine breaking through. At last she burst out impatiently, "Will this dull, dreary mist never lift, I wonder?" And would you believe it? A voice she knew all too well immediately answered from beyond the trees. "No, it won't," replied Resentment. "Moreover, you might just as well now know that this is going to continue for no one knows how long. Higher up the mountains, the mist hangs thicker and thicker still. That's all you can expect for the rest of your journey." Much Afraid pretended not to hear, but the voice went on again, almost at once. "Have you noticed, Much Afraid, that the path which you are following isn't going up the mountain at all, but is almost level? You've missed the upward way, and you are just going round and round the mountain in circles." Much Afraid had not exactly noticed this fact, but now she could not help realizing that it was true. They were not climbing at all, but simply moving along the mountainside with constant ups and downs, and the downs seemed to be getting more frequent. Could it be possible that they were really gradually descending the mountain instead of going up? In the bewildering mist, one simply could not see anything, and she found she had lost all sense of direction. On asking her companions what they thought about it, they answered rather shortly, because, of course, she ought not to have listened to any suggestion from Resentment, that they were on the path which the shepherd had pointed out, and would certainly not allow anyone to persuade them to leave it. "But," persisted Much Afraid petulantly, "don't you think that we may have missed the way in this mist? The shepherd said the path led upward, and as you see, this one doesn't. It runs along the side of the mountain. There may easily have been a more direct way which we didn't notice in the mist." Their only answer was that they knew better than to listen to any suggestion made by Resentment. At that, the voice of bitterness broke in quite clearly. "You might at least be willing to go back a little way and look, instead of insisting on going on and on along what may prove to be wrong path, leading you round in circles." Sorrow and Suffering took absolutely no notice, but unfortunately Much Afraid did, and said with still greater petulance, "I think you ought to consider the suggestion. Perhaps it would be better to go back a little way and see if we have missed the right path. Really, it is no use going on in circles, getting nowhere." To this they replied, "Well, if we are going round in circles, we shall eventually arrive back to where we went wrong, and if we keep our eyes open, we shall be able to see the path we missed, always providing that it does exist and is not just a bit of imagination on the part of bitterness." "You poor little thing," came the whisper of self-pity through the mist. It's too bad that you have been put in charge of such obstinate mule-like creatures. Just think of the time you are wasting, getting nowhere at all. Trudge, trudge, day after day, nothing to show for it, and you ought to be getting up onto the high places." So they went on, whispering and talking at her through the clinging mist, which shrouded everything and made it all seem so ghostly and dreary. Of course, she ought not to have listened to them, but the mist was so bewildering, and the path so unspeakably tame, that she found something in her heart responding to them, almost against her will. Suffering doggedly led the way, and sorrow just as doggedly was her rear guard, so that there was no possibility of turning back. But Much Afraid found herself limping and slipping and stumbling far more often and badly than at any other stage of the journey. It made her very disagreeable and difficult to deal with. It is true that after every stumble her conscience smote her, and she apologized sorrowfully and abjectly to her companions, but that did not prevent her slipping again, almost directly afterwards. Altogether it was a miserable time, and the mist, instead of clearing, seemed to get thicker and colder and drearier than ever. At last, one afternoon, when the only word which at all described her progress is to say that she was slithering along the path, all muddy and wet and bedraggled from constant slips, she decided to sing. It had not been mentioned before, but Much Afraid did not possess the gift of a sweet voice any more than a pretty face. It is true that she was fond of singing, and that if the shepherd sang with her she could keep in tune and manage quite nicely, but if she tried alone the results were by no means so good. However, the mist was so thick and clammy that she was nearly stifled, and she felt she must do something to try to cheer herself and to drown the ghostly voices which kept whispering to her through the trees. It was not pleasant to think of her relatives now having the opportunity to entertain themselves at the expense of her very unmelodious voice, but she decided to risk their comments. "If I sing quite loudly," she told to herself, "I shall not be able to hear what they say." The only song which she could think of at the moment was the one which Sorrow had taught her in the hut, and though it seemed singularly inappropriate, she lifted up her voice and sang quiveringly, "How lovely and how nimble are thy feet, O prince's daughter! They flash and sparkle and can run more fleet than running water. On all the mountains there is no gazelle, no roe or hind can overtake thee, nor can leap as well, but lag behind." Canticle 7:1. There was a perfect silence as she sang. The loud, sneering voices of her enemies had died away. "It is a good idea," said Much Afraid to herself jubilantly. "I wish I had thought of it before. It is a much better way to avoid hearing what they are saying than putting cotton in my ears. And I believe, yes, I really do believe, that there is a little rift in the mist ahead. How lovely! I shall sing the verse again." And she did so. "Why, Much Afraid," said a cheery voice close beside her. "I have not heard that song before. Where did you learn it?" There, striding toward her with a particularly pleased smile on his face, was the shepherd himself. It is just impossible to describe in words the joy of Much Afraid when she saw him really coming toward them on that dreary mountain path, where everything had been swallowed up for so long in the horrible mist, and everything one touched had been so cold and clammy. Now with his coming, the mist was rapidly clearing away, and a real gleam of sunshine, the first they had seen for days, broke through at last. "Oh, shepherd!" she gasped and caught hold of his hand and could say no more. It really had seemed as though she would never see him again. "Tell me," he repeated cheerily as he smiled at them all, "where did you learn that song, Much Afraid?" "Sorrow taught it to me," she replied. "I didn't think that she knew any song, shepherd, but she said the words and the music came to her as we were climbing up through the forest. I asked her to teach it to me because I know I am a goose, but it makes me think of the time when you will make my feet like hinds' feet, and I won't ever have to slither again." and she looked shamefacedly at her bedraggled and muddy condition. "I am glad you sing it," said the shepherd more pleasantly than ever. "I think it is a particularly nice song. Indeed," he added smilingly, "I think I will add another verse to it myself." And at once he began to sing these words to the same tune. "Thy joints and thighs are like a supple band, on which are met fair jewels which a cunning master hand hath fitly set. In all thy palace search where'er you please. In every place there's none that walks with such a queenly ease, nor with such grace." Canticle 7, 1. "Oh, shepherd," exclaimed Much Afraid, "where did you find that verse to fit in so nicely to the tune which Sorrow taught me?" Again he smiled at her in the nicest possible way and answered, "The words came to me just now as I followed you along the path." Poor Much Afraid, who knew that she had been slipping and stumbling in the most dreadful way, indeed worse than at any other time, flushed painfully all over her face. She said nothing, only looked at him almost reproachfully. "Much Afraid," said he very gently in answer to that look, "don't you know by now that I never think of you as you are now, but as you will be when I have brought you to the kingdom of love and washed you from all the stains and defilements of the journey? If I come along behind you and notice that you are finding the way especially difficult and are suffering from slips and falls, it only makes me think of what you will be like when you are with me, leaping and skipping on the high places. Won't you like to learn and sing my verse just as much as the one which Sorrow taught you?" "Yes," said Much Afraid thankfully, and taking his hand again, "certainly I will learn it and sing about the cunning master hand which takes such pains with me." By this time, the mist had actually melted right away, and the sun, shining brilliantly, was making the dripping trees and grass sparkle with joy and brightness. All three thankfully accepted the suggestion of the shepherd that they should sit down for a short time and rest and rejoice in the sunshine. Sorrow and Suffering withdrew a little, as they always did when the shepherd was present, leaving him to talk with Much Afraid alone. She told him all the dismal tale of their long wanderings in the mist, the way resentment, bitterness, and self-pity had been bothering her, and her fear that perhaps, after all, they had wandered from the path and lost their way. "Did you really think that I would let you stray from the right path to the high places without doing anything to warn you or prevent it?" asked the shepherd quietly. She looked at him sorrowfully and said with a sigh, "When resentment and the others are shouting at me, I am almost ready to believe anything, no matter how preposterous." "You had better become a singer," said he, smiling. "Then you won't hear what they say to you. Ask Sorrow and Suffering if they have any more songs which they can teach you. Do you find them good guides, Much Afraid?" She looked at him earnestly and nodded her head. "Yes, very good. I never could have believed it possible, shepherd, but in a way I have come to love them. When I first saw them, they looked so terrifyingly strong and stern, and I was sure that they would be rough with me and just drag me along without caring how I felt. How I dreaded it, but they have dealt with me very, very kindly indeed. I think they must have learned to be so gentle and patient with me by seeing your gentleness. I could never have managed without them," she went on gratefully. "And the queer thing is, I have a feeling that they really like helping an ugly little cripple like me in this way. They do truly want to get me up to the high places, not just because it is the commandment which you have given them, but also because they want a horrid coward like myself to get there and be changed. You know, shepherd, it makes a great difference in my feelings toward them not to look upon them any longer with dread, but as friends who want to help me. I know it seems ridiculous, but sometimes I get the feeling that they really love me and want to go with me of their own free will." As she finished speaking, she looked up in his face and was surprised to see that he actually looked as though he were trying not to laugh. He said nothing for a moment or two, but turned slightly so that he could look round at the two guides. Much Afraid looked too. They were sitting apart in the background and were unaware that they were being watched. They sat close to one another and were looking away up to the mountains toward the high places. Their veils had been thrown back, and though she still could not see their faces because their backs were toward the shepherd and herself, she was struck by the fact that they seemed even taller and stronger than when she had first seen them waiting for her at the foot of the mountains. There was something almost indescribably majestic about them at that moment, a sort of radiant eagerness expressed in their attitude. They were talking quickly to one another, but their voices were so low that she could not catch what they were saying. Was it possible? Yes, it was. They were actually laughing, that they were talking about something which thrilled them with eagerness and expectation, she felt quite sure. The shepherd watched them for a few moments without speaking. Then he turned back to Much Afraid. His eyes were laughing at her, but he said quite gravely, "Yes, I really believe you are right, Much Afraid. They do look to me as though they really enjoy their task, and perhaps even feel a little affection for the one they serve." Then he really did laugh out loud. Sorrow and Suffering dropped the veils back over their faces and looked round to see what was happening, but the shepherd had something more to say before he sped them farther on the journey. The laughter died out on his face, and very seriously he asked, "Do you love me enough to be able to trust me completely, Much Afraid?" She looked at him in the usual startled fashion, so natural to her whenever she sensed that he was preparing her for a new test, then faltered, "You know that I do love you, shepherd, as much as my cold little heart is capable. You know that I love you, and that I long to trust you as much as I love you, that I long both to love and trust you still more." "Would you be willing to trust me," he asked, "even if everything in the wide world seemed to say that I was deceiving you, indeed, that I had deceived you all along?" She looked at him in perplexed amazement. "Why, yes," she said, "I'm sure I would, because one thing I know to be true. It is impossible that you should tell a lie. It is impossible that you should deceive me. I know that I am often very frightened at the things which you ask me to do," she added shamefacedly and apologetically, "but I could never doubt you in that way. It's myself I am afraid of, never of you. And though everyone in the world should tell me that you had deceived me, I should know it was impossible. Oh, shepherd," she implored, "don't tell me that you think I really doubt you, even when I am most afraid and cowardly and despicably weak. You know I trust you. In the end, I know I shall be able to say, 'Thy gentleness hath made me great.'" He said nothing for a little, only looked down very tenderly, almost pitifully at the figure now crouching at his feet. Then, after a time, he said very quietly, "Much Afraid, supposing I really did deceive you, what then?" It was then her turn to be quite silent, trying to grasp this impossible thing he was suggesting, and to think what her answer would be. What then? Would it be that she could never trust, never love him again? Would she have to be alive in the world where there was no shepherd, only a mirage and a broken, lovely dream? To know that she had been deceived by one she was certain could not deceive? To lose him? Suddenly, she burst into a passion of weeping, then after a little while looked straight up into his face and said, "My Lord, if you can deceive me, you may. It can make no difference. I must love you as long as I continue to exist. I cannot live without loving you." He laid his hands on her head. Then with a touch more tender and gentle than anything she had ever felt before, repeated as though to himself, "If I can, I may deceive her." Then without another word he turned and went away. Much Afraid picked up a little icy cold pebble which was lying on the ground where he had stood, put it in her bag, then tremblingly rejoined Sorrow and Suffering, and they continued their journey.